of and limits on Congress addressed first and in greater detail than those of other branches. In addition to the powers granted to Congress in Article 1, what other provisions in the Constitution addresses legislative powers? Why? How have the enforcement provisions of amendments adopted since the Civil War increased congressional power? You may begin.
In a letter to Connecticut Governor Jonathan Trumbull in July of 1783, Senator Oliver Ellsworth wrote, "The power of Congress must be defined, but their means must be adequate to the purposes of the Constitution. It is possible there may be abuses and misapplications, still it is better to hazard something than to hazard at all. During the period of salutary neglect, the colonies thrived without the interference of a central power."
When drafting the Articles of Confederation, state sovereignty was to remain paramount under a weak Congress. This Congress lacked effective enforcement to resolve issues among the states, which was why people demanded more power to be vested in a national legislature.
James Madison and the framers of the Constitution addressed the powers and limits of Congress first and foremost in order to establish a newly formed limited government. Influenced by John Locke's legislative supremacy, the framers looked at the success of the state legislatures such as Virginia, Maryland, New Jersey as exemplary models. A bicameral legislature was elected by popular vote to act as a check and balance against the executive and judicial branches and represent the will of the people.
While creating a stronger national government, states were still fearful of possible abuses and misapplications from its central power. Article 1, Section 8 defines the adequate powers of the legislative branch to provide for and uphold the Constitution. Congress authorized military engagement in Iraq under Operation New Dawn in 2003 by using the powers granted in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11. Article 1, Section 9 provides negative rights, restricting Congress from ex post facto laws, bills of attainder, or suspending writ of habeas corpus.
In addition to the powers granted in Article 1, other articles in the Constitution address legislative power. Under Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2, the Senate has the power to approve judicial appointments by the executive branch. In addition, Article 3, Section 1 allows Congress to establish and ordain inferior courts below the Supreme Court. Recently, the Senate unanimously voted in favor of President Barack Obama's nomination of Todd Hughes in the U.S. Federal Circuit Court of Appeals.
Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 grants Congress the power to outline the regulations and rules necessary for a territory to become a state. In November 2012, Puerto Rico held a referendum and many citizens expressed their views to become a state within the U.S., something Congress would need to approve of.
After the Civil War, Congress used the powers granted in Article 5 to propose the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, along with several others such as the 19th, 23rd, 24th, and 26th, all of which expanded congressional power through enforcement provisions. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was specifically enacted to enforce the 13th Amendment's ban on slavery. By 1968, the U.S. Supreme Court was relying on the act to prohibit individuals from discriminating against racial minorities in the sale or lease of housing.
Under the Necessary and Proper Clause, Congress has the power to enforce legislation or to solidify the powers vested in other government branches. Congress expanded individual power in Section 2 of the 18th Amendment by policing the enforcement of regulating the prohibition of liquor. The legislative branch used the Necessary and Proper Clause to approve the Volstead Act in order to increase the power to implement the 18th Amendment.
The Voting Rights Act of 1965 upholds the 14th and 15th Amendments by prohibiting the use of illegitimate tests or laws discriminating against voters. The precedents set forth in South Carolina v. Katzenbach of 1966 established federal intrusion on state voting regulations.
The powers of Congress can be limited by other governmental branches because of checks and balances that exist within the federal government. In the City of Bourne v. Flores case of 1997, the Supreme Court ruled that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was unconstitutional because it was not within the bounds of Congress's enforcement power granted in Section 5 of the 14th Amendment.
Benjamin Franklin commented that no man's life, liberty, or fortune is safe while our legislature is in session. Influenced by Lockean views, the framers created the legislative branch to reflect the interests of the people. However, Locke's views have degenerated into a powerful federal legislature distant from the people they represent. With the legislative branch refusing to compromise on spending policies, non-essential agencies and organizations funded by the government have shut down. This stalemate between legislative bodies is impacting millions of Americans, making Franklin's statement valid 250 years later.
Congress has currently a 12% approval rating, yet have a re-election percentage of over 90%. How is it that we disapprove of actions of Congress so much, yet approve them re-elect them almost 90% of the time?
One, I would say, once you get elected, generally get some party ties, which means you can get some funding by the Republican or Democratic Party that you have been elected to. Also, even though they only have a 12% approval rating, people don't like change that much. Even though Obama said change is the way, people like the person that they're voting for, such as Dean Howard or Harry Reid of Nevada.
And when you look at the 12% of, that's just Congress in general. So when you look at Senator Ted Cruz, who is a senator for the Lone Star Republic of Texas, you can see that by him as a teabagger, by him giving a filibuster on the Senate floor to defund Obamacare, he's still reflecting the interests of his constituents in Texas by defunding Obamacare. Therefore, he can still be reelected, but just the Congress in general, because of political parties, they're not doing anything.
Congress has keeps getting reelected because they keep doing whatever their constituents are telling them to do and not what the federal government really needs, acting more in their constituents' favor than being more of the delegate for the entire country as a whole.
Based on what you have just said, do you think that this is a danger to the future of our nation as governed? If you allow the desires of the constituency of 1 or 2 or 3 states to override the needs of the nation as a whole?
I completely agree with that statement, only because partisanship in political parties have completely obliterated just a lot of actual true qualities and ideals of both parties. So constituents will be not represented as well as they should be, only because of the political factions and inadequacies of both parties.
Do we need the political parties though? I mean, can Congress function without their organizational benefits or go ahead.
Not the way it's set up right now, because right now it's set up with a majority party and a minority party. So Congress needs a 2-party system to be effective in the way that it's organized right now.
You talked about the Voting Rights Act, and yet Section 5 has been repealed. What kind of an impact is that going to have on congressional powers and their ability to legislate for the common good?
In the case of Oregon versus Mitchell, states were declared the authorization to qualify voting rules against the Voting Rights Act Amendment of 1970. Therefore, it created a problem between state and national governments because the boundary line of power was not well defined.
How does that apply to the Voting Rights Act today with the case Shelby County versus Holder?
So when you look at the Supreme Court and how they decided that Section 5 was unconstitutional, now that the states have to go to the Congress in order to solidify their state voting laws, now you see this idea that the framers' idea of legislative supremacy, so now the legislative branch is the one reflecting the needs of the people.
How does gerrymandering affect how Congress is running today?
Gerrymandering is, one, illegal in Carr v. Kerr, which decides that you cannot redistrict. Baker versus Carr, sorry. That you cannot redistrict zones. And gerrymandering basically is drawing the zones to your benefit, or drawing a zone so you can get majority of Republicans in your zone so you can get reelected.
In the court case Reynolds v. Simmons, it uses the 1-man, 1 vote to say that redistricting has to be equal to the population. So Congress currently right now is using that to represent districts, to represent the population in every area of the United States.
Also, redistricting, we just had a problem in Nevada with redistricting. Our state legislature tried to keep redrawing the zones. We have a Democratic legislature and a Republican governor. So the legislature of Nevada thought that they were drawing equal and fair districts, but the Republican governor kept saying, no, this is not fair for Republicans, no, no, no. So he sent it to the courts, which then hired a third party to draw those districts, which in turn made the Democrats and Republicans unhappy with the drawing of the districts.
And the main focus here when it comes to gerrymandering is redistricting of whether or not we're harming an opposite political party or you're benefiting another political party. It's just the idea that the framers, when they created the Constitution, they didn't know that political parties were going to be a tool essentially in the machine that they created. So therefore, if we just get rid of political parties and we don't have all these problems with gerrymandering and harming one political party or benefiting another.
Does Congress or the federal government have the right to set rules and regulations in terms of how districts can or cannot be redrawn every 10 years after the census?
I think that Congress should not be able to have a say in whether or not a state should redraw their districts or not, because it's just another burden that the federal government would just take over, and to redistrict 50 states all within after the 10-year census, it's just going to be really bad for the federal government to control and maintain.
Who should mediate then if you have an intransigent state that refuses to redistrict at the threat of voting rights of a group that doesn't have the same economic or social microphone? In other words, if the state of X said, no, we don't want to redistrict, and it's hurting group Y, shouldn't Congress then step in and force the states to redistrict to protect voting rights at large?
Oh, I believe what you're asking is who should draw the redistricting? Is that what you're trying to ask?
No, I'm saying who should mediate if a state doesn't want to redistrict even though the census suggests that they should?
I would say Congress should, which is disagreeing with Henry, because they need to step in, or the courts could even step in with judicial review and say that, no, you cannot, you need to redistrict because you're hurting these interest groups.
Or the Supreme Court can step in for example, the court case Thornburg v. Jingles, when North Carolina wanted to redistrict so black people couldn't have a vote. So in that case, the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to be able to do that. So the Supreme Court could now step in instead of Congress as well.
We'll stop there. Comments?
I don't know, to me it seems like there's a misread of the second bullet point. It says how the enforcement provision